Hi, welcome to the first video of DIY Sloth. Right now we're looking at my laundry room that I just remodeled, but I over-tightened a toggle bolt which caused the drywall to bulge out and lose its strength. So I'm going to show you how to cut a hole in the drywall and install a cross stud. Here are most of the tools I needed for this project. There's a hammer, a Kreg Jig, some screws, some drywall tape, joint compound, a joint knife. I used a miter saw, which isn't pictured, a drill, and a stud finder. First step is to remove the items on the shelf and the shelf. That way I can remove the drywall toggle bolt. For this project, it isn't necessary to remove the toggle bolt since I'll be removing the drywall, but I just thought I'd show everyone how to remove a toggle bolt. Now I'm using my drill to remove the screws that are holding up the shelf supports. Then we'll remove the drywall toggle bolt and we'll go from there. Best way I've found for removing toggle bolts is to get a decent sized flathead screwdriver and break the little plastic pieces in the middle, and then you can pry the circular plastic piece out of the wall, and then the backside falls off and now you just have a hole. Also, if it wasn't obvious before, you can now easily see the circular area from where the toggle bolt was over tightened and pulled the drywall out of place. Next, we're going to grab our stud finder and mark out some of the nearby studs. That way we can cut along our studs because we're going to need something to attach our cross studs and drywall to. Next, we are going to grab our level and mark some vertical lines along the studs and some horizontal lines about 6 to 12 inches above and below our cross stud. That way we have lots of room for working in our tools. For the vertical cut lines, do your best to draw them at the center of the stud. Now that we have our lines drawn, we're going to use our jab saw to cut a hole in the drywall. A useful technique that I found is when you're trying to cut your hole in the drywall, if you cut your hole at an angle, you'll be able to easily place your original drywall piece back into the hole without it falling into the wall. In this instance, this technique won't be that useful since I've already damaged the drywall here and I'll need to replace this whole section. I removed a lot of the time of me cutting out the drywall since it took me a while. It took me a while because in the area I wanted to remove the drywall, there were screws holding it in to both studs. I ended up having to use a flat pry bar to pry the drywall out. I then unscrewed the screws that were holding the drywall in previously, but there were still some nails that needed to be removed. To remove the nails, I grabbed my 6-inch long wrench, and then I grabbed the nails and twisted and turned and pulled until each nail came out. I then measured how long of a cross stud I would need. You want it to fit in there pretty snugly. After cutting my cross stud to fit snugly, I placed it in the wall. I then marked on the wall where I wanted my cross stud to go. The next step was to use my Kreg Jig to drill some pocket holes in the cross stud. You want to make sure that the front of the cross stud is flush with the front of the stud, or that the front of the cross stud is slightly behind the front of the stud, otherwise you might have trouble with your drywall. Now that I've drilled my pocket holes, I am attaching my cross stud to the studs. I then measured the opening so I would know what size drywall to cut. After the fact, I learned that a better way of doing this is to just trace the piece of drywall that you cut out. After cutting out my piece of drywall, on the wall I marked the limits of the cross stud vertically and the horizontal limits of the pocket hole screw. That way, when I'm attaching the drywall to the studs and cross studs, hopefully I can avoid the pocket hole screws and also be able to hit the cross stud. I use 2-inch long drywall screws for drilling into the studs. You can just use one screw in each corner, but I added an extra one since I missed with one of my original screws. I used 1 5/8 inch drywall screws for drilling into the cross stud because that's a little bit of a shallower member. I probably could have used 2 inches for the cross stud as well, but I didn't. Next, we're going to take our joint compound and our 4-inch joint knife and get to mudding. This will be my first time mudding, so go easy on me. I kept a part of the video of me mudding in here for completeness, but you should really look at another YouTuber's guide on how to do mudding properly. I'll put a link down below of someone I found very helpful. After the initial layer of joint compound was placed, I grabbed my 10-inch joint knife to smooth it all out. I should have put some drywall tape in between the two layers around the edge of my new drywall, but I didn't. This led to a gap appearing between the new and old drywall after all of the joint compound was dry. This is why you see me put 2 layers of joint compound in that both dry, and then another thin layer, and then the drywall tape, and then another thin layer of joint compound, and then I let it dry, and then I put another thin layer of joint compound in. After all my layers of joint compound have dried, I grab a 120 grit sanding block and I lightly sand my newly mudded drywall. I then grab a damp paper towel and wipe off where I sanded. This way the paint will stick well to the newly mudded drywall. The next and almost last thing is to paint. I use 2 layers of paint, that way you can't tell the drywall is there. Now it's time to reassemble. First, I show you the piece of wood I used before with 1 screw and 1 cutout for the toggle bolt. Then I show you the piece of wood I get to use now with just the 2 holes for the screws. Now I'm leveling my new piece of wood and attaching it to the wall and cross stud with just 2 screws. I then screw my new piece of wood into the cross stud. After this, all that is left is to put the shelf on the supports. That's it for this video, so if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Thanks.